Thank you. Why don't we start, Allegra? Do you have? Did you want to give a little talk and then afterwards discussion, or is that okay?
Yeah, look, that is fine. And I mean, I think you said laid out that most people start with a bit of a self-introduction. So I'm happy to.
You have such an amazing path, so it would be very interesting to hear how and what and why you are where you are.
Well, a bit like Jack, life takes you in some places that you don't always expect it to, and not always linear paths, but that's okay. So I think I'm the member for Wentworth. So Wentworth is in the eastern suburbs of Sydney, probably most iconically known for Bondi Beach, but it's a particularly wealthy area of Sydney and actually of Australia. Very sort of a lot of professionals, a lot of finance people in technology, those sorts of people, but as well as a high degree of people who live here because they love the lifestyle, love the beaches. A lot of sort of skews younger than the rest of the country, skews more to renters and more to apartment dwellers. So it's a sort of particular type of part of the country. I've always lived in this area. I grew up here. I lived overseas for 10 years, but I've basically either lived overseas or I've lived in this local area. So my roots are very deep here. And I genuinely, if you'd asked me 2 years ago, would you be sitting in Parliament, I would have said absolutely. I would have laughed and said, I don't know what you're talking about. And so I had no real sense of, that I would end up in Parliament. I had done economics at Cambridge, at Trinity. I then worked at McKinsey because I was really interested in, developing those kind of broader business skills. I always say, there are three things about me that make sense of my career. One is that I'm a child of a migrant. Two, that I like economics. I like that way of seeing the world. And three, that it's not just about money, it's also about social conscience. And I think those three things really explain a lot about my career. So, in terms of as a child of a migrant, I'd grown up working in my family business. I then, started working in economics, but then ended up spending 10 years running my family's fashion business. And I'm not particularly interested in fashion, but it's a really important, it's an important part of my history. I'd worked there since I was 10 years old. And for me, it's a sort of defining view on how business can help people, like my mum, who was a migrant, succeed and create a life for herself. Studying economics, I think, was really transformational for me. And, I really like that combination of the public and the private, because it is about why people make decisions, but it has big implications for how we run the country. So having studied economics and started out at McKinsey, I then worked at the UK Treasury. I worked in Kenya for a not-for-profit. I was really interested in to see how economic policy is really sort of plays out in real life. And then finally, this idea that it's not just about money. Certainly, I grew up in a family business. We're very focused on, being successful as a family business. But, the way I grew up was always about saying, look, how do you make a contribution? And so that drew me to my most recent job, where I was running a not-for-profit working with kids from low socioeconomic backgrounds and businesses, including Accenture, interestingly enough. But also it drew me my interest into the renewable energy sector, where I was chair of a Sydney Renewable Power Company, and ultimately it drove me to decide to stand for Wentworth. I decided to stand for Wentworth because I was approached. And it was a very hard decision to stand because I love my job. I've got young children. And, it's a very public risk running for politics, and particularly as an independent, because you really have to get people behind you as opposed to behind a party. But I decided to do it because I felt that from a climate point of view, from an integrity point of view, and particularly from a women point of view, the coalition, who was, the traditional holders of my seat, were not serving the community. They were certainly not serving me. And there were so many people in my community who said, look, I do not feel served by this party, by their rhetoric, by their policies, that I felt that someone had to do something. And, and I put it to the people who approached me, who were a group of local residents. I was saying, look, if you feel I'm the best person out of the people who are interested, then I will stand. but if you can find someone better, also feel free to use them too, because it is, as say, a big undertaking to do this, and possibly a bit more for me than some, because my dad was a politician, but on the Liberal Party. So I was very conscious that I was, a bit of, and his father was as well. So stepping out of that family piece, but he was 100% behind me. And then really for me, what I'm trying to achieve in politics, I think a couple of things. Look, the overarching piece is, I want us to govern for the long term best interest of our country. I think that, climate action is a critical part of that, but it's not the only thing that's important. And it is, I think, a symptom of our sort of short-termism and, sort of the tribal nature and the destructive nature of party politics, is why we have ended up in such a mess in relation to climate action in Australia. So for my goal as an independent is in all policy areas to work on how do we govern for the long term, and how do we actually do politics differently and actually raise the game in politics. And part of that is also how do we make sure that the full community is represented in the room, and that includes women, but also includes ethnic sort of minorities and just the broader, more that it reflects the country. And I think that long term is also, it's governing for the long term, and it's actually governing in the interest of the community based on what they think is important. Because, we are here for the long term. The community is interested not just in the next 3 years, they're interested in, their children, their children's children's future. But we lose that, sort of that connection between parties and community and the long term. And so it's really, for me as an independent, the freedom I have is to make decisions for the long term, but also to really listen to the community, to challenge the community, where I disagree with the community, to try and change their mind, but really govern, sort of use my vote, use my advocacy, use my power to put forward legislation to drive and support the interests of this community here. And then that's not about being parochial. That is actually just being about based on what the values are of the community, and how they see, the future of this country. And so that's really what has driven me to date. In terms of my focus, what I'm, particularly for this term, I think the big thing my community asked me for, they asked me actually for 3 things. They asked me to take action on the environment. They asked me to govern, to put forward and to use the lens of kindness and decency in looking at social policies. And they also asked me to stand up for business, because, as I said, it's a very business-focused community. And so that's really the frame in which I look at things. I work very closely with the government and actually across the Parliament on climate policy to make it better. We're currently debating the safeguard mechanism, which is for big industrial emitters. So I'm negotiating with the government right now, negotiating with the Senate as well, to how to make that legislation better, as well as how to drive more household electrification and in household action on climate change, sort of priorities from a climate point of view. From making the world, I think, from making, to standing up for decency in our community. My community's asked me to stand up for refugee rights in how we treat our refugees. They've asked me, to stand up for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and, what the voice for Parliament. And so in those areas, it's been working with the government, but also taking a very public role and leadership role in relation to, for instance, the voice to Parliament and also in refugee rights, to really stand up for those and to get real outcomes, as we have had so far in relation to refugees. And then lastly, it's about working with business. And so, my business community has asked me to be the voice of business in the Parliament, and really and have that sort of economic perspective in the Parliament. So I am, in terms of that means engaging on industrial relations law reform, which, the government is leading and which the business community really has very strong views on. It also means sitting on the economics committee, which is, I have to say, a huge privilege, but does make me think, wow, I could have even, it really draws me back to my time at Trinity and the amazing economists I was able to learn from there, because it's very much dealing with, the very fast rate rises. And I'm particularly specifically leading some work in relation to tax reform. Trying to break open issues that are very difficult for the major parties to address, because coming back to that point, which is, how do you govern for the long term, and how do you govern for the that in a way that embodies the values of your community? So that's really what I'm seeking to do. So that gives you a bit of a sense of me. I guess otherwise I'm married with 3 children, so that has its own challenges, but it's certainly enjoyable.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for this wonderful overview. You mentioned you studied economics in Trinity. Who did you work with? Do you know Steve Satchel and
Yeah. Yes, I did. I mean, I think probably my most memorable moment was we had one tutorial with Lord Mirrlees, who was who had received the Nobel Prize for Economics.
Yes.
And then we also hosted a dinner for one of the governors of the Bank of England. So those were some of the kind of highlights. But otherwise, it was very much the sort of, and Amartya Sen actually was also the master at the time. So
of course, he's in Queensland now, I think, or I think.
Yes, I think so. So he's absolutely a leader, particularly in development economics. So those are some of the people that I remember very, very vividly, as well as a fabulous tutors and lecturers across the scheme.
We had one other Trinity alumni who was member of parliament, not sitting like you, but past. Julian Huppert, maybe you've seen it. He was a member of the parliament in London for Cambridge.
Oh, really?
And so one question I asked him, and which I would like to ask to you, I have never been a member of parliament, and also members of parliament work differently in different countries. Parliaments are very different, I guess. So one thing I'm interested in is, like, what is your life work like? Following you on social media, I can see that you're very, very active with the community, which you also mentioned very much, because I mean, you represent your community. But actually, for the community, what is a typical day in your life, or how do you achieve your targets? You'll have a program, and how do you push towards your program so that this gets actually realized in Parliament?
Look, I think it's interesting. So in Australia, members of the House of Representatives, the lower house, spend about 20 weeks a year in Canberra from Monday to Thursday, and the rest of the time they're in their electorate. And so I think being a member of Parliament, you really have sort of 2 quite different jobs. You have your parliamentary life, and then you have your constituent community life. And the goal is, I think, to bring as much of those together as possible. So, for instance, in a non-sitting week, which is this week, I would be, I would probably spend, probably at least 2 days out in the community in either, I'm visiting a childcare centre this afternoon. I visited one of our universities the other Friday. I'll visit a women's shelter. I'm spending 2 hours out literally at cafes and around the beaches on Friday, just really, trying to talk to people and have that open kind of surgery where people can come and talk to me about issues that they're facing in their community, meeting with local councils about local issues. And there, your goal and role in those areas is, understanding if there are local issues that are part of the federal government sphere that you need to champion, either for an individual personally or for a group of individuals or a sector who, is speaking up in your area. And you have, and there's a lot of joy there. It's helping people with passports or visas or things like quite small things, but actually that make a real difference, or trying to solve real problems. And then the other part of the role is the national piece. So it's about in Parliament in relation to how do you vote on the different pieces of legislation? How do you advocate on pieces of legislation to get amendments through, to get changes made to legislation, but also and how do you put forward better pieces of government and governance. And so, for instance, at the moment, we're particularly speaking up around economic issues, which means putting forward a number of amendments on some of the economic reforms at the moment, such as the National Reconstruction Fund. It means speaking quite a lot in the media about some of the recent changes the government's put through, and it's organising also those I think organising a tax roundtable with eminent economists from across Australia around what should the future of the Australian tax system look like. And so part of your job is proactive and driving the agenda that you want to pursue, but part of it's also reactive, understanding, this week there's a big, obviously an enormous defence a deal that's been done, with the AUKUS treaty between US, UK and Australia. And so I've just come off a briefing on that because, it is a really important part of Australia's policy. And so as a member of parliament, you do need to be across it, and you need to understand what sort of questions you should be asking about it, identifying concerns and also, supporting, what you should support as well.
Okay. For how many, I should have looked it up, but how many people are you representing or are you responsible for?
Well, it's about 140,000 people. Okay. So the voting, it's not all of those are voters. So roughly just over 100,000 voters, but about 140,000 people.
Oh yeah, but that means you can get to know quite a fair share of them, I guess.
You do. I mean, I think that is positive. It's actually, interestingly, I think we've got about half the number of. So we have 150 members of the House, and the UK's got, I think, about 600. So even though the UK's got it represents each sort of member of Parliament represents a bit fewer number of people than we do. But at 100,000, you can get to know a lot of people. And I'm lucky, being in Australia, I've got a very small constituency of 38 square kilometres. I have members of Parliament whose electorates, cover literally over 1 million square kilometres, and takes them more than a day to drive from one end to the other. So they have different sorts of challenges than I do.
Jack asked about this independent, what was it called, team? So
Teal.
I'm not familiar with all the details of any details of Australian politics. So maybe Jack can ask more, or maybe you can just tell us a bit more about your special situation. You've already touched on it, but when did it start, and what's the reason this independent movement came about?
I mean, I think that's a really good question, and there have been independents in the Parliament for some time, but there's sort of normally one or two. And so what is most unusual about this Parliament is the scale of the number of independents and crossbenchers.
How many are there?
So we've got currently 17 crossbenchers out of 151 parliamentarians, and so 4 of those are Greens, and the rest of them are of independents of different ilks. It's the previous Parliament, I think there were 6. Previous to that, I think there were 3 or 4. So that is, it's very unusual to be at this scale, and to be honest, they haven't had the scale of a crossbench since I think before the Second World War. And so I think what was particularly unusual about the last election was a culmination of a trend of a decline in the votes for the major parties. So there's a Liberal Party, there's a coalition, which is a Liberal National Coalition, and then there's a Labor Party. They used to get in, I think in the 1990s, 90% of the primary of their first vote. In this election, they got, just under 70%. So there has been a very significant shift away from the major parties. And I think it talks to, a lot of the dissatisfaction of, politicians seeming to be more interested in their own gains rather than the community's gains, their own parties as opposed to the community's party priorities. And so I think, and a sense that they're sort of out of touch with the priorities of and the desires of the community. And so that I think was a very big driver of that long-term trend, but also it culminated I think in this time because there are a number of high-profile independents who have been up in the last couple of terms who have sort of demonstrated how you can be an effective independent. And so I think a lot of communities look to those other communities and said, well, they've got an independent, why can't we? And that's certainly what happened in my community. We had a woman called Zali Stegel, who's an MP, who who was elected in the last election, and her electorate is very similar from a demographic and other aspects to my electorate. And so my community would like, look, she's standing up for climate action, but she's also standing up for good, strong economic management. We want someone like that in our electorate. And that's when I ended up, and that's why they approached me to run. And so the teal is because it's the traditional colour of the sort of conservative part of Australian politics is blue, and the greens are the ones who obviously champion climate action. And so the teal is a combination of that green blue. So it's that combination of sort of strong economics, but climate action is where the term teal came from.
Yeah, that's fantastic.
So
yes, please.
I'm interested in the sort of day-to-day mechanics of how things work amongst the independents. Do you communicate a lot with each other and try to stay aligned, or is it kind of a lot of individuals doing their own thing?
Look, it's actually we do communicate. It's very collegiate, so we do communicate a lot. I was on a call this morning. I normally do a weekly call with the other so-called teals, but we also do, whenever Parliament's sitting, we'll do a weekly call with the whole crossbench, which is more about understanding what's going on the crossbench and aligning where we believe we should align. And so I think there's a huge degree of respect for each other, and also recognition that we have different skills and that we're bringing. So, for instance, there are two doctors on the crossbench. Zali's a lawyer by background, and we've got people. Carly's worked in business. Kate's worked particularly in Indigenous affairs, and so for each of those people, we all sit on different committees. So I will listen to them on different issues. I will seek their advice and input on different issues. But we will do many sort of joint briefings. We will share views, but ultimately we all can vote. We all have that independence around how we vote and what we think is most important. And I think that creates a lot of work for all of us, because we are, we're bringing that independence. But I also think it means that we're always, in touch with the community's views on different issues. And I think it spurs us each. We each look at each other and go, wow, you're doing that really well, and try and emulate it. So I think it's actually very sort of positive as well, that we can learn from each other, but we don't feel trapped into a view where, if you say this, I have to back you, because, everyone feels, that sort of freedom to say, look, if you can convince me, I'll back you, but I'm not going to back you just because you said so. And I think that's pretty important.
So you're more like
one of the points that one of the observations that I have that comes out of that is that the independents generally, not true of everyone, but many of the independents are not career politicians. Whereas most of the people in the major parties do seem to be career politicians. And for my money, that's it's a good thing that there are people who aren't career politicians, because I don't think the career politicians serve us very well. Are there any what's the right question to ask, other than for your own observations on that? I think is there any hope that can be offered to someone like me who'd like to see more people like you in Parliament?
Oh, thank you. Look, I think it's interesting. I think there's a lot we can do individually and as a crossbench, but I think there's also a lot that just our presence has done to how the parties think about their seats. I think that they are much more on notice that, and also Di Lee, who's the independent from Fowler, which is Western Sydney, who took a safe Labor seat, from one of their stars, because she was someone, their star had no connection to the community, and the community said, no, we want somebody who we know and, we think understands us. And so I think that, there's a real lesson, I think, to the major parties, and which I think, we'll see how much they take, that you have to come back to how you support your community and how you truly represent them. And there's no such thing as a safe seat. There's, all of our seats that we took, they were all safe seats. They were all, people should have been set up for life, to be honest, coming into these seats, and they wouldn't have to worry about winning the election. They could just worry about, rising up through the ranks. And I think that it's brought people back to ground, that, your community actually will speak up. And I think that brings greater accountability to the major parties. That said, I think they're still really struggling, with the base. So, and particularly I'll talk to the coalition here, because the base is is more, in most cases, the base is more extreme than the general population. You look at how they're struggling to elect women or pre-select women, and it's because the base is more conservative than the sort of community. And people have put in the time. Like, you can't get pre-selected into a major party seat without having done years and years and years of work, and as you said, often worked in politics. And I think they do need to think differently about this if they are going to get a broader range of people that are better emulate the country, better reflect the country. So I do think the coalition is grappling with this lesson. I'm not sure how far Labor is, because they feel they've obviously won the election, and they come very much through the unions. So whether they've worked for the party, many of them have worked through the union movement. So I think that's I think they take the point on, you have to bring someone from your local community. Don't parachute someone in. But we'll see how well they do in terms of reflecting that variety, and particularly for the Labor Party, I genuinely believe they need to bring more business people into the Labor Party and into their part of politics, because, with all the goodwill in the world, there's a blind spot there when so many people have come up through the union movement as opposed through, the business community. And, ditto from the coalition, there should be some union members who are part of the coalition. So that is a broader reflection of the country.
Sandy, do you have questions maybe?
No, I'm just listening with interest. I don't have kind of very much exposure to kind of Australian politics, but kind of listening with interest on Allegra's.
I can keep asking questions.
Please do.
So
go ahead.
What do you see as the future of the Teal movement?
Look, I think there's an opportunity to continue to grow this, the crossbench, and I think there's a potential to change. I think the sort of long-term formation of the party, of the parliament. We've been pretty comfortable for a long period of time with having a Senate that isn't owned by one of the major parties, and while it is tricky, it generally generates better outcomes, because you have to negotiate more heavily. And I think that you look at the government, they've got a 2-seat majority. The previous government had a 1-seat majority. It's very, the parliament is actually very close. And so I think there's a very significant chance that we're going to end up in a sort of long-term scenario where we have sort of minority governments, where, the crossbench becomes more powerful, probably, I'm sure, coalesces into, different groups, and we'll see where that ends up. I think if, people often, will the Teals be a party, who you never know what is going to happen in life. But what I would be very surprised about is if people lose that sense of truly voting with their conscience and having a free vote, which in theory the coalition has, but no one exercises it. And so I think, apart from Bridget Archer, so I think that's, that sort of responsiveness, that community responsiveness, is what people are looking for. And I think the long-term impact will be a greater focus on community, and, truly understanding what your community wants and leading from that level is I think, is a powerful lesson from the election.
maybe to switch from, there's one more thing I wanted to ask you about Australian politics, which is very interesting, is I think you call it First Nation, which are the people who lived in Australia a long time ago. Most countries have, you know, in Japan, there's Ainu in the north, and you know, even in Austria, I'm from Austria, from Vienna, we have the Celts, who were there 2,000 years ago, have been driven, you know, out to Ireland, and so, and I've seen from your social media engagement that you're doing a lot in this area of the issues. But can you talk a little bit about it?
Sure. And look, and so I think there's a thinker in Australia, a person called Noel Pearson, and he, I think he puts it really beautifully about what Australia is. And he says, you know, Australia is a combination of three things. It is the longest continuous civilization of any country in the world. The Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who have continuously lived and been in Australia for 65,000 years with that continuous culture. You have the British institutions and democracy, which is so important to Australia's stability and I think prosperity. And then it's, you know, Australia, I think I think makes very good claim to being the most successful multicultural country in the world, where up to around a third of people are born overseas, and almost 50% of Australians, you know, have at least one parent born overseas or born overseas themselves. And, you know, I'm one of those people whose mother was born overseas. And so those are, I think, the three pieces of Australia. And, you know, but when you look at the sort of statistics, you know, our migrants thrive, you know, the Anglo-Saxon or sort of British origin people thrive, but Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities do not thrive at the same level. They're actually you know, there's very significant gaps in terms of outcomes. You know, in probably the most shocking one is the Aboriginal population is the most incarcerated group of people, sort of ethnic group or cultural group in the world, and that is a terrible outcome for this country. And so I think there's a lot of reflection and over many years of how do you help resolve this and how to move forward so that we all share, I think, in Australia's prosperity and success. And so as part of this, there has been a big discussion about how should Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people be recognised in the Constitution? How do we affect reconciliation? And there was a grassroots movement which delivered something called the Uluru Statement of the Heart, which was born out of, you know, a sort of long sort of conversations and bringing together of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. And they came up with three key things around a voice to Parliament, to provide the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander perspective on policies that affected them, treaty, because there is no treaty between Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and the rest of the nation, and also truth-telling, the sort of acknowledgement of some of the frontier wars, of some of the, I think, the terrible parts of Australian history, which certainly I didn't learn about when I was at school, and I'm not sure, Sandy, if you did. But it wasn't high on the curriculum. I think, I knew more, I think, about Tudor, Henry VIII's queens and all his wives than I did about some Aboriginal history, certainly when I was growing up. And so the voice is the big piece that is coming up this year. There'll be a referendum to whether there should be a voice to Parliament of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people to speak, to provide advice and guidance to government about issues that particularly affect them. And that's the conversation that's being had at the moment. I'm a very big supporter of this, because I believe if you're going to make laws, you must make them, which are meant to be of benefit to people. You must make sure that you listen to them and understand what they believe is truly of benefit to them. Otherwise, you end up, I think, where we have been, which is lots of well-intentioned people really achieving very, very little and actually disempowering other people. But there are lots of questions about this. It's very challenging to pass a referendum in Australia. And so there's a lot of work that myself and others need to do to, make sure we understand the questions that people have, we get good answers to those questions so that people can come and support that voice.
I mean, another thing which comes to mind here would be education. For example, Ian Drayton, who is head of investment banking of Goldman Sachs for Asia, he, together with others, they created a foundation in UK for immigrants from certain areas to access, for example, Trinity College and Cambridge, Oxford, and to get high levels of education. I mean, that would, I'm sure you're doing that also in Australia, I guess.
Look, yeah, there's actually a fabulous organisation called the Aurora Foundation, which sponsors Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people to attend institutions like Cambridge and Oxford. You know, the people get in on their own merit, but they provide, you know, the financial support, but also the belief that they can do it, which I think is absolutely.
And then they become role models for others.
I think that is exactly right. So that, you know, those role models and that education piece is really important. But they're, you know, so particularly with the Aboriginal community, they are often in much more remote areas than the rest of the country. There's a lot of geography has a big impact on policy, as well as so the sort of issues that might face somebody who's living in, you know, where I am versus someone who's living in, you know, far north Queensland in a remote community, they're quite different. And so I think there's a lot about this, which is about, you know, recognising some of those unique challenges and perspectives that come from that, you know, that sort of lifestyle. So and that, you know, having those people having a voice, you know, in relation to the policies that make a difference to them.
Thank you so much. I think we are reaching the time limits for you now in your busy schedules.
Not at all. Is there any other wrap-up questions that anyone had an answer to?
Well, any wrap-up? If there isn't one, I would have one, which is the bigger world. You know, how do you see? Are you optimistic about the world? At the moment, we are a pretty difficult situation with various. The polite way is to say geopolitical issues, yeah, but the unpolite way to say is that we really have war going on, fortunately far away from Australia, but still, you know. So what is your view on the future now, you know, more long term, like apart from, of course, of warming issues and climate issues?
Yes. Look, I mean, I'm generally an optimist, and I still think you'd be better to be born in the world today now than you would be born in any other time in the world in the past. So I think you know, while we do obviously have very significant challenges, you know, it is still globally, you know, we have never been richer, more prosperous, more, you know, more people being able to fulfill their potential, to have education, to ensure that their kids can grow to adulthood. You know, they're the things that I think make a huge difference to people's lives. So on broad terms, I'm optimistic. I think from a climate point of view, we have a huge challenge ahead of us. But I believe that particularly the mobilisation of the business community and you know, things like the Inflation Reduction Act, which is, you know, a huge mobilisation of again, the business community, but also the broader community, will really set us on the right track. So I think we are, you know, I'm more optimistic about this now than I have been for some period of time, and particularly in Australia, where it has been such a bone of contention. I hope I'm not wrong to say I think we're moving past that. I hope into the action zone, which is where we need to go. In terms of, you know, broader political and geopolitical challenges, they are significant, and you know, I think like all things, it's about maintaining balance and maintaining open dialogues between countries. And I think that is, you know, the US and China, so Russia and the West, you know, these are tensions that will, you know, I think will dominate, you know, for the coming decades. And, you know, and that starting point is, you know, be ready for the worst, but also invest in it, not that scenario not happening. So how do you invest in the relationships? How do you invest in, you know, in the diplomacy, so that you can avoid, you know, some of the more drastic, I think, potential outcomes. So I think they're very difficult times we've got ahead, and, you know, my heart goes out particularly to the people in Ukraine, who have dealt with so much, and are still dealing with it. But that's, you know, it is an interesting time.
That's a great, partly optimistic tune to finish. One thing is, if you ever come to Tokyo, you know, I'm in Tokyo, so I created the Trinity in Japan. So we have regular dinners once a month. We just had 2 weeks ago with a new master who is, for the first time in, I don't know, 700 years or something, is a lady, Dame Sally. Dame Sally, she was previously responsible for the health system of England and Wales, I think.
Okay,
so she's
brilliant.
A health expert.
Well,
so I hope you come and have dinner with us in Tokyo sometime when you visit.
I would love to. And otherwise, thank you very much, Jack and Sandy, for joining, and Gerhard for organizing. I really enjoyed it.
And if you stand for the next election, I can't
and,
vote, but I wish you win. I wish you all the best for your next election in case you decide to stand again.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, everybody.
We need more like you.
Oh, thanks very much. Thank you. Great to connect as well. I hope to see you around Canberra sometime, Jack. We'll keep out. See you later. Bye.
Thank you.
Ciao.